I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that it's a maxim in the United States, a law of our national heritage, that we never discuss religion and politics. But anytime two Americans sit down and have a discussion, it inevitably leads to matters of religion and politics. And anytime that there's a discussion on religion, sooner or later, and most often it's sooner, the discussion focuses on some element of the doctrine of predestination. It's one of those things that mystifies us, and at the same time it stimulates our minds, and the bewilderment that we experience in the face of the concept of predestination sometimes will encourage us to dig more deeply into theology. And it's just one of those subjects that generates a lot of interest and discussion, and also controversy. And as I look at the history of Christian scholarship, we see that every great Christian teacher, every theologian that the church has ever produced at some point or another has had to address this question of predestination. And though there's wide divergence of interpreting the doctrine of predestination, there's one thing that we can find that every theologian I've ever examined agrees on, and that is that this doctrine must be treated with great caution. It's a dangerous subject because the more we study it, the tendency it has to raise more questions than it answers. And I'm convinced that of all of the doctrines that we struggle with in Christendom, there's none that is more shrouded in misunderstanding and confusion than the doctrine of predestination. So that in itself calls for a certain kind of sober caution as we approach this subject. And I would add to the theologian's warning of caution that I think it's also a doctrine that requires us an extra measure of charity as we struggle with it, and that we need to be patient with each other and with those who differ from us in our views of this particular question. Because I said there's a lot at stake here, and feelings can run very high when we discuss the matter of predestination, and we ought to be careful to manifest the fruit of God's Holy Spirit among ourselves as we try to deal with it. Those that follow Augustine in the doctrine of predestination would include, and this may surprise you, and this may even be challenged by some, but first let's put Augustine himself, since he did believe what he himself taught, so we'll put Augustine at the top of the list. Then I would say Augustine's perhaps most eminent disciple with respect to theology in general, and even these doctrines in particular. In my judgment, the man belongs on this side of the column, St. Thomas Aquinas. Francis Schaeffer, I can almost hear him screaming at me from heaven right now, because he would certainly not agree that Aquinas belongs in that category. But remember that Aquinas himself indicated his indebtedness to Augustine more than to any other theologian in church history. But since St. Thomas Aquinas is the supreme theologian of the Roman Catholic Church, and since contemporary Roman Catholic theology does not embrace the Augustinian view of predestination, Protestants generally make the assumption that therefore St. Thomas didn't either. But if you can challenge that if you want. I will leave that open to debate and discussion. The next man, there's no debate. The next man definitely belongs with Augustine, and he is the Reformer's reformer, the man who most emphasized predestination in the 16th century, in the Reformation. And who was that? No, that wasn't John Calvin. John Calvin was his junior partner. The man who most adamantly defended the Augustinian view of predestination was Martin Luther. Now that comes as a surprise, because in the world today, Lutheranism lines up opposite Presbyterianism on this particular doctrine. That's because of a little quirk in church history, where shortly after Luther's death, the Lutheran body under the leadership of Philip Melanchthon took a different turn and did not follow Martin Luther in his articulation of the view of predestination. But I think it's safe to say that Luther wrote more on predestination than Calvin ever dreamed of, and that there's nothing in the doctrine of predestination that I can think of that John Calvin ever taught that Luther didn't teach first. and louder. So then now we can stick Calvin in there as a junior partner, John Calvin, and then I would add to this side of the column, Jonathan Edwards. Now, remember now, we're going to be honest and fair and above board about all this. Now, if you would ask me this question, R.C., who do you think are the 5 greatest theologians that ever lived? Okay? I would have no difficulty identifying the 5 greatest theologians that ever lived. They would be Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, and Edwards. And I'll tell you what, they're way ahead of the next 5, whoever they may be. Now, as biased as that may be, I think that it would be safe to say that if we asked any 100 theologians from any different denominations who the greatest 10 theologians were in history, at least 98 out of that 100 would mention these 5 in the 10. I mean, here are recognizably 5 titans and giants of the Christian faith. And if they all agree on espousing the Augustinian view of predestination, does that mean that the Augustinian view of predestination is the correct one? Absolutely not, because these 5 men disagreed on many things, and though they agree on the essence of this particular matter, is no guarantee that their views individually or collectively are the first one. We carry no brief for the infallibility of human tradition or for the infallibility of Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Edwards, none of that, or even all of them together. But I'll say this, when those 5 agree on something, it gets my attention. The word predestination in English is made up of a prefix and a root. The prefix pre means before. And the word destination is a word we're all familiar with in the English language. Many of you came to Ligonier this week because Ligonier was your destination. It was the place to which you were going. Anytime you make travel reservations with your travel agent, the thing they want to know is, what is your destination? That is, where are you headed? Where do you hope to end up? Now, when we're talking about the doctrine of predestination, we are not talking specifically about questions of whether or not God directly caused an automobile accident to take place, or if you were determined in advance to be sitting in the chair in which you are sitting right now. The doctrine of predestination is concerned specifically with the question of our ultimate destination. There are only 2 destinations open to us as human beings. Ultimately, they are heaven or hell. That is, to be in a state of salvation or to be in a state of damnation. And predestination proper is concerned not with those daily questions of whether or not I dropped this chalk on the floor, if that was predestined. That would fall under the theological heading of providence. And those questions are legitimate questions for theology. How much God's sovereignty is involved in our everyday actions and activities and so on. But the doctrine of predestination proper is concerned about the question of salvation. And predestination is concerned about something that takes place before we arrive at that destination. Predestination has to do with God's involvement in the ultimate outcome of our lives. Now, this may strike you as strange, but both Augustinians and semi-Pelagians agree that predestination is something that God does. Predestination has to do with God's choice regarding salvation. God's choice regarding the salvation of people. And this may also surprise you that both sides agree that God makes that choice about our ultimate destination before we are even born. Indeed, at the foundation of the world, as we just read in Ephesians, that God chose certain people at the foundation, before the foundation of the world. Now that may surprise you. John Wesley believed that. Philip Melanchthon believed that. I meant to put Philip Melanchthon on that list a moment ago too, but I didn't. But in any case, where the point of division is at this critical juncture. On what basis does God choose to save you before the foundation of the world? Is God's choice to save you based upon his prior knowledge of something that he looks down the quarters of time and sees that you are going to do? And therefore, looking down the quarters of time, he knows, for example, that you're going to respond positively to the gospel, that you're going to choose Christ when the opportunity avails itself to you. And knowing that you are going to choose Christ, God then chooses you to be saved. But he bases that choice on his prior knowledge of Dick's decision. Is that clear? So that God is choosing you for salvation, but he's choosing you because of something he foresees in your life. The Augustinian view, on the contrary, would say that what God foresees in your life has nothing whatsoever to do with his choice of you. That his choice is sheerly by the good pleasure of his will, without any view to anything you may or may not do in the future. That's basically the heart of the issue, of whether or not the choice is with a view to what you do or without a view to what you do, or what you will do with respect to the proclamation of the gospel.